Okay. Well, I want to welcome everyone. Let me remind people to turn off pagers, cell phones, because they interfere with the sound system. I want to mention some upcoming events. One event that is not on the calendar, but you're invited, we just ask that you RSVP if you're interested, is this Thursday morning from 8:30 to 10:30. Charles Ryan, chairman of Deutsche Bank in Russia, will be speaking on Russia's role in the global economy. Then next Monday at noon, Eric Lohr from American University will talk about the war in Georgia. On Wednesday the 19th in the afternoon, we have an event with a number of speakers on cultural exchanges, and if you're at all interested, there's a full list outside on the calendar. We can tell you more. And then the last event this month, on Monday the 24th at noon, Catherine Stoner-Weiss from Stanford will be speaking about Medvedev's challenges in governing Putin's Russia. So if you've never heard Catherine before, she has been a kind of star in the political science field for some time, and I think that will obviously, it's a provocative title, and I think it'll probably be a provocative talk. Well, I've been asked, why does the Kent Institute spend so much time remembering Galina Starovoitova? After all, she's from the past. Russia's moved on. She's not a 21st century person. And she's only one of many people who have been assassinated in Russia. So what's the big deal? Well, I think it's a big deal in part because she was a friend, in part because she's an alumna of this institution, and more importantly, because she's someone who wrestled with a number of unresolved questions that Russia still faces. Questions which, if anything, are more important in the 21st century than they were in the 20th century. Issues about how Russia can move forward in a time of difference and diversity around the world. This seminar is part of a much larger piece. We're very pleased to, over the years, over the past decade, to have hosted a number of Galina Starovoitova Fellows in Conflict Resolution and Human Rights. This was a program announced by Secretary of State Albright in Moscow shortly after Galina's death, and we're very thankful that the State Department, despite all the changes that one can imagine from Albright's time till now, has always steadfastly supported this program. We're also involved as a partner with many other institutions in two events, one in St. Petersburg and one in Russia. The St. Petersburg program is actually taking place in two parts. There's a commemoration on November 20th, the anniversary of Galia's murder, with a memorial concert and a ceremony at Nikolskaya Cemetery. Then there's a seminar program on the 25th organized by Alexander Sengurov, the Ombudsman for Human Rights in St. Petersburg, and it'll take place at the St. Petersburg affiliate of the Higher School of Economics. We can get you information about this if you're interested. And on December 10th, also in St. Petersburg, a session of a conference marking the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights will be dedicated to Galia's legacy. And then in Moscow, on November 28th, the Institute of Philosophy is hosting a series of speakers on ethnic and federation relations, which is being organized by Leokadia Drobezheva and will include speakers from Moscow, Kazan, Tallinn, and Kiev. Our part here is to try to remind people about Galia and her legacy, and we couldn't think of two better people to do it. Margie and Harley Balzer. I think they're both well known to everybody in this room. They were close personal friends with Galia. They introduced me to her. Margie is a research professor at Georgetown in the anthropology department and at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. She's editor of the journal Anthropology and Archaeology of Eurasia. She's edited a number of additional volumes, but most importantly, she's the author of a book that's become something of a classic in its time, The Tenacity of Ethnicity, A Siberian Saga and Global Perspective, which I guess is just about a decade old now. Time flies. She has her undergraduate and graduate degrees in social and cultural anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania and Bryn Mawr, and her field work has been concentrated in Sakha and Western Siberia. Harley is Associate Professor of Government and International Affairs and Associate Faculty Member of the Department of History at Georgetown. I think we all know Harley as the longtime chair of Georgetown Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Research, a position he held for 14 years, I think. He has an extensive list of publications and activities. I simply will note that he's best known for his work on the Russian middle class and on science policy, and he earned his bachelor's in history and political science from Washington University in St. Louis, and his master's and PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Blair. I want to start, and I will begin by saying you used the right word, assassination, not murder. But I want to celebrate Galina Starovoitova's astonishing life. So this is not a whodunit. Rather, my format is going to be of stories and vignettes that carry out themes that she cared about, that show you what the resonance of Galina Starovoitova's life and policies was for today. And thank you, Blair, for giving us a chance to delve back into the Galina Starovoitova archive. Let me begin by saying that she was an intellectual, brilliant, and yet very popular. Indeed, I believe it was probably at a Kennan talk and at other talks as well that she sometimes said that sometimes even populism is necessary in Russia because they hadn't had a chance to experience that. I learned this on my own spine when I ended up carrying back jars of jam from a village once, a Siberian village in the Khanty-Mansiyski okrug, for Galya, when they learned that I knew her. She cared about us. She knew our problems, talked about them straight to us through the TV. Especially older women and also younger women would say this to me in the villages, as well as many other people. She would have hated the way the open, free media has been gutted, particularly given the nice things she used to say about Vladimir Putin. But let me talk a minute about her field work as well. She'd done a lot of it herself. She was a pioneer in urban anthropology, especially her work on Leningrad ethnic groups that became her doctoral dissertation. She also did fieldwork in nearly every ethnic conflict hotspot, especially in the Caucasus, Abkhazia, Ossetia, and of course Karabakh, where she did quite a bit of fieldwork, research, and then policy activism. She used to wonder where her reports went, how high past the head of the Institute of Ethnography, past Bromley, who was the head of it. But by 88, she was called in to talk to the Central Committee about Karabakh. And at one point, she went to Karabakh with Andrei Sakharov himself. And of course, it's appropriate, given her human rights activism, that the image of Galina with Andrei Sakharov is behind us. At one point, she went to Karabakh during one visit and was kidnapped by Azeris. Her calm, direct Savi helped free her in a couple of hours, as well as the frantic efforts of other people around her. Karabakh was part of what propelled her into parliament as a deputy representing Armenia in the Congress of People's Deputies, and I'll let Harley talk about that a little bit more. But moving from her activities as a scholar to an activist, let me get into some other aspects, especially the nationalities, policies, and issues. As Yeltsin's first nationalities advisor, she was famously blamed for Yeltsin's phrase, "Take all the sovereignty you can swallow," said, among other places, in 1992 in Tatarstan. Well, credit, Galina used to say, modestly, went to several of his advisors, not just to her for that. And of course, at the time, and we have to remember the context, the point was not to encourage secession, but to, quote, preclude the disintegration of the Russian Federation. In other words, to urge people, especially regional elites, to think carefully before you try to secede without resources, without planning. There's also a telling Galina Starovoitova vignette here that goes back to the Soviet period, when the Ivano-Bitentaysk region was first announced in an area that I've spent a lot of time in Sakha Republic, then Yakutia. Galina's reaction was that it was a kind of official ploy, so that then they'd be able to have Narva in Estonia become an official Russian area. But even though she understood some of the mechanisms behind this, she was also for it, recognizing the realities of ad hoc asymmetrical federalism. She used to use the term flexible federalism as well. And here I want to mention a very important contribution, Galina's legacy, kind of in wearing both hats at the same time, as a policymaker and also a scholar. Her Institute of Peace project, which was very important in terms of all the interviews she did with world leaders about when secession can become morally acceptable. She used to use the phrase moral legitimacy. And I'm going to just briefly outline to you, and this is truly part of her legacy that is relevant today, 5 secession criteria that she said all 5 were needed, 5 secession criteria that involve what it would take for a world community to accept a group of people on the basis of ethnicity seceding from a given country. The first was intolerability, a sense of colonial or neo-colonial repression of a people. The second, historical right, the territorial claim to borders despite disputes over time. Although she said, including here at the Kennan, one could always find nationalist experts to document claims in the 2,000 years ago range for certain kinds of legitimacy. Nonetheless, she was interested in the point of some widely recognized indigenousness. And this brings me to her third criteria, ethnic composition. While multi-ethnic democracies exist, she admitted it was easier if demographics do involve a majority of one group, preferably a 2/3 majority, but not necessarily. And this brings me to the fourth criteria, which is the expression of the people's will. There had to be a referendum. And that referendum had to be at a time that wasn't just right after a crisis. It had to be a politically viable, observed internationally referendum in which everyone was involved, not just one ethnic group. And finally, very importantly, part of the package was responsibility for consequences. There needed to be understanding that there might be possible group transfers, people who consider themselves refugees, economic transition ramifications, all of these things needed to go into the thinking. And in the end, only 2 republics were even remotely possible within the Russian Federation with all these criteria. And they were Tuva in the Far East and Chechnya. The key in all of this for Galina was negotiation, insurance of human rights. She knew perfectly well that issues of Helsinki Accords sometimes were in tension with United Nations guarantees of international borders. She asked for moratoria on secession. But here's a story from Galina's life about Chechnya, and I'm grateful very much to Luda Yutkovskaya, friend, colleague, and assistant of Galina Starovoitova, who reminded me recently of this. Galina as Yeltsin's nationalities advisor, called Joko Dudarov after he became president of Chechnya and said, "We need to talk to you." And he was so grateful. He said, "No one has called me from the White House. Thank heaven someone's listening." And yet it wasn't possible to have that conversation and negotiation go on. And this is part of what got her fired as Yeltsin's nationality advisor. She would have been horrified at the Second Chechnya War, as of course she was at the first, and at Beslan and Nalchik and Russia's involvement in Ossetia, at forced consolidation of national areas into regions. For instance, the recent so-called referenda out in the Buryat areas of Ust-Orda, Naga. She used to say, "We've renounced the big brother role," and yet somehow that didn't quite happen for everyone. She predicted that governors would start to be appointed with quite serious concern just before she died. And she warned that that would be a short-term solution. Her own moderate nationalism was quite serious. Galina had reaffirmed her Russian Orthodoxy for herself, was baptized, kept an icon, and rejoiced at the resurgence of the church. But she was worried about the 1997 law that passed the Duma, and she was against it, the law on religion, that she felt could become a mechanism for repression of religious minorities, those not in the traditional religious categories of Orthodoxy, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. She represented a moderate nationalism, as did President Yeltsin. She was proud of her Russian Cossack mother and her partially Belarusian father, and she had a kind of balance between admiration of Russian identity and language, and pride of that, and fascination with Western values. Her own paper that she founded and edited was called Европеец. Did we mention that she edited a newspaper on top of everything else that she did? She also was one of the only Russian Orthodox members and one of the founding members of a Jewish advisory council. She predicted, but would have been horrified by the upsurge of anti-Semitism in Russia and of skinhead attacks on migrants in the streets. She worried about the red-brown coalitions and indeed was one of the first people to start talking about that. Here I might add that new calls to go after increased cases of extremism by President Medvedev, for instance, a call that came last Friday at a conference, are very welcome and are terribly important given the environment. But I want to end my remarks on a more upbeat note, a little bit more upbeat anyway. Galina also loved, perhaps contrary to the stereotype of a serious scholar and a Russian politician, rock and roll concerts. She loved their joy and their energy. She befriended and helped the rock band Alicia. She would have been shocked by the recent suicide statistics coming out of the Sakha Republic for youth suicides, and very sad at the gutting of spontaneous demonstrations by the revival of Soviet-style orchestrated demonstrations, for instance, Nashi at the American Embassy last week, or in Chechnya under President Kadyrov. One of her close friends, Vladimir Voinovich, famously said and wrote, "Spontaneity, comrades, must be organized." But she thought this had gone out. On the other hand, she would have loved the increased dynamism of the internet and the travel opportunities for young people. One of the most serious slogans in her last political campaign was, "The most important in my platform is the future of those who today do not vote." Thanks. Turn this over to Harley Balzer.
Thank you very much. Well, if Galina were here today, she'd probably be suggesting that we celebrate one of the positive outcomes of the current economic crisis, which is that the Gazprom tower that was going to be built in St. Petersburg appears to now be a casualty of the lack of budget financing that would make it possible to put this giant phallic symbol in the city skyline. Galina was a Petersburger. She was a first-rate scholar. And one of the things we learned from her was a lot about how the Soviet academic system worked. Galina had actually written an entire dissertation about field work that she had done in the Caucasus. And her institute needed a collective monograph for fulfillment of their plan for that particular year. This is the institute in St. Petersburg. And they essentially took her dissertation and published it as a collective work. Galina's response to this was to go out and write an entire second dissertation. This is the book that became the ethnic groups in Leningrad. And say, well, that's just the way the system works. On the other hand, when she was offered the chance to move to the institute in Moscow, she jumped at it. But when she was still in Leningrad, one of the things I remember was an evening in early spring of 1986. It's before perestroika was accomplishing much. Margie was already out in Sakha Republic doing field work. And Galina and I had a date to meet and have supper, and met, actually, I think in front of a Berioska on Nevsky so I could buy the bottle of wine. And we spent the next 90 minutes wandering the streets of Leningrad, looking for some place we could buy something to make for supper. And we failed. I mean, there was no meat, no fish. After an hour and a half of this, we went back to her apartment and made omelets. And as we were sitting there looking at our plates, she said, real socialism will be when you can buy something for money. Now, Galina is not known that much for economics, but she had a real understanding, and maybe the most important part of that was something that has really gotten lost over the last decade or so. She thought that the oligarchs, as horrible as they were a phenomenon that could be dealt with. If the state had the proper capacity and the judicial system did its job, you could deal with people who were abusing the system. If the corruption was in the budgeting process, in the abuses of bureaucrats, in a Soviet-style system where the managers had control rights without any responsibility, that's the kind of corruption that would be much more difficult, if not impossible, to root out. And she really did pay attention to it. At the end of her life, it was one of the most important things that she was doing. A friend of ours who was arranging some kind of memorial in honor of the 10th anniversary of her assassination actually had some interaction with someone in the presidential administration. And when they met face to face, this person said, if Galina were still around, maybe we wouldn't be in as much of a mess as we are, which I found a fascinating comment, admission. Galina wasn't perfect. Any of us who knew her well knew that. Anybody you know well isn't perfect. One of the things that always drove us crazy was that Galina always had 3 appointments scheduled in the same time slot. And part of the reason for that, and Margie alluded to it, is that in addition to all of the political work she was doing and the academic work and the various committees that she was on, she also had individual people as projects. And she always had a bunch of those going on at any given time. That first Alicia concert that we went to, we were about a half hour late because Galina was making sure that a young woman from someplace in the Urals, who was the daughter of a friend, got there so she could meet the musicians. She subsequently married one of them. And I got a dose of this myself when I was unexpectedly the only foreigner invited to her husband's 50th birthday party, still in Leningrad. And I couldn't quite understand why they would want to take that risk. It was still pretty early in the Gorbachev years. And I finally found out later on, her parents were there. Her father had been a heavily decorated military engineer and inventor, had clearances, obviously couldn't meet foreigners. I could never have come to her apartment just with him. But around a table with 30 people, if this foreigner happened to be there, that was okay. And it was the only time in his life up to that point where her father had met an American. She wanted him to find out that we only had one head. I guess the nature of her political career is a really important reminder of what politics was like in those years. And it's a piece of the history of the country that I'm afraid is really being lost. Galia's political career started because she broke her leg. She slipped on the ice, she fell, she spent the next 6 or 8 weeks sitting at home. About all she could do was watch television. This was height of glasnost. Television was worth watching in those days. And she began to get particularly interested in what was going on in Nagorno-Karabakh. And in early '88, when that crisis really heated up, Galia tried to figure out what she could do, and she decided that she would pen a letter to some writer friends and also to the Armenians in general, saying that the Russians shouldn't be telling them what to do, but she empathized with the situation. Now, this was a matter of phenomenal timing. This letter started showing up all over the country. She was getting phone calls from everywhere. And in Yerevan itself, they made maybe 100,000 copies of it and passed them around. I visited their place a few months later, and we couldn't talk at all because the phone rang every 3 minutes with somebody else from Armenia or from some other part of the Soviet Union calling to discuss this with her. It resulted in her being invited to be a candidate in the first elections in the Soviet Union in Yerevan, and she agreed. She was running against some pretty nasty Soviet officials, and during the campaign, helicopters began dropping leaflets on the city warning the Armenians to beware of false Russian friends. This had, of course, the opposite effect from what was intended. Armenians were the most highly educated ethnic group in the Soviet Union, highest literacy rates. They knew damn well who had helicopters and who didn't. And Galia won that election with about 75% of the vote. That healthy skepticism about the officials and the secret services is something that Galia thought was really important. It was a crucial part of the history of that time, and it's one of the things that we really shouldn't be losing. And I think that may have been one of the reasons why one of the most important issues to Galia for many years was repeatedly raising the issue of lustration. I mean, imagine what Russia would be like today if people in the secret services had been barred from political activity for a decade. And I guess the last thing I wanted to say in the formal part of this is a little bit about her assassination. I had dinner with her in Moscow about 5-6 weeks before this happened. And she talked rather seriously at one point during the evening about the threats to her life, which I foolishly dismissed as exaggerations. And afterwards I thought about it. She had experienced this over and over again in her decade in politics, starting, of course, with threats from Azerbaijan when she was defending the right for Armenians to have sovereignty or independence in Nagorno-Karabakh, threats in St. Petersburg in the early 1990s. She actually went to London with Bakatin for a conference on reforming the security services. Didn't endear her to a lot of people. Zhirinovsky's Liberal Democratic Party threatened her repeatedly. Her insistence that the Duma condemn Makashov for his anti-Semitic comments got her another set of threats. Of course, her efforts to expose corruption in St. Petersburg produced serious threats. And then her announcement that she might run for governor in either Leningrad Oblast or in St. Petersburg itself produced a great deal of unhappiness in some quarters, and again, serious threats. But as I think back on this 10 years later, what strikes me most about her assassination is that it really seems to have been a turning point. Radio Liberty has a useful list of the dozens of people, high-profile people who were killed. I counted 25 just in Moscow and Petersburg. I won't read the list, partly for time and partly because I'd inevitably leave out somebody important. But if you look at the really painful number in 1994, 95, 96, slightly smaller number in 97, 98, almost every time you could find some economic connection. Beginning with Galia, you can't do that. I think, I may be wrong about this, but from going back over it and looking at it this time, this was really the first purely political assassination, as opposed to one where money was involved. And we've had a bunch of them since. Increasingly, it's harder to find the economic motives. Occasionally they're trumped up. But more and more often, they're political. Politkovskaya is a perfect example of that. In the last year, Chervochkin, Yevloyev, Yamadeyev, these, you don't find economic reasons for this. This is being done because of people's political activity. And the treatment of the people responsible for murders is becoming a matter of real concern. Litvinenko's accused murderer, whether he's guilty or not, has never had to face any justice system, but he is a member of the Russian Duma. Yanderbayev's killers came back and were pardoned. Vitaly Kaloyev, the bereaved father who killed the Swiss air traffic controller, served 3 of his 5 years, came back and was immediately made the deputy minister of construction in his home republic of North Ossetia. The signal that this sends is something that, I really can't decide whether the government fails to understand or understands only too well. Better to be feared than loved. But the ramification of it is that when you get crimes that are ambiguous, where we don't know whether it really was a murder or an attempted murder, and Karina Moskalenko perhaps is the best example. I honestly have no idea which version of this is correct. But everyone outside of Russia, almost without exception, was willing to give credibility to the likelihood that this was an attempted murder. The Western press pounced on it. That's the consequence of a system where, as far as I can tell, only one of the high-profile murders of the last 15 years has resulted in a convincing conviction. That record has got to be changed if the government is going to have credibility. And I guess I'd like to end by giving us a reminder about Galia from a colleague in Yerevan, the brilliant ethnographer Levan Abramyan, who, when he was asked to kind of talk about her life, said, Galia was the person who never responded to any difficult situation by saying, that's not my problem. And when I think about the things she took on in her much too shortened life, that was one of the things that was most amazing about her. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to open it up. I just want to say I didn't know if I would say anything, but I want to underscore her scholarship in that wonderful book she wrote on ethnic groups in Leningrad, which has, in many ways, spawned an emerging academic field. And I just note that last Friday I received an email from a Canadian scholar who is going to go back and write about ethnicity in Soviet cities precisely because he came across that book. And for those of you who think of her as a politician and as an activist, she was a scholar before she was any of those things and wrote really, really interesting work, which brought together, I think, her two of her real passions, Leningrad and diversity. And if it's a hard book to find. In fact, a copy of it has disappeared, but it can be found, and it's well worth finding. Why don't we open it up we have a few minutes if there are questions, comments, observations.
I see a lot of people who knew Galina very well. I'm delighted to see them.
Vlad Zubak?
Well, I met with Galina Starovoitova. I was lucky to meet her at Brown University. And the first impression was a great charm and great wit and intelligence. My question is something I don't know. What was her position on other conflicts that were brewing at the time in Abkhazia, and especially with regard to Georgia, as Georgia was plunging into the abyss under Gamsahurdia?
Galina was very nervous about what had happened under Gamsahurdia in Georgia. And one of the things I debated mentioning in my remarks, so thank you for that question, was whether I should bring up the rather delicate issue that Galina actually had as an idea when she was President Yeltsin's nationality advisor, that the Russians shouldn't be big brothers, but they should have something, and she would think of this as a burden rather than an imperial design. She wouldn't have gone for the idea of surreptitiously giving people passports or anything like that. But she had the idea of a Russian Federation version of the United Nations peacekeeping units. The Blue Berets fascinated her as a concept. And so I have to say that she was sympathetic to their possibility of leaving Georgia, not necessarily to be incorporated into Russia. This is where I might have had arguments with her, so I'm trying to keep my own opinions out of the answer to this question. But what she was doing was trying to imagine a situation in which the least amount of bloodshed could happen with the most number of people feeling that they had had their human rights satisfied and not trampled on. So the concept of a Russian version of peacekeeping forces, and that did happen in that area after the first conflicts in Abkhazia, would have also gone for some of her answers on Ossetia, because I've been tussling with myself about exactly where she might have been in this most recent set of issues concerning Ossetia. Your question was more specifically on Abkhazia. So I had actually, considered this, and I can't speak for what she would say today. But I do know that she was extraordinarily interested in a moratorium on the conflicts. I mean, the first thing you have to do is cool down. And then the other main principle, which I did mention, is continual negotiation contact. Stay as close as possible to a range of leaders on all sides of any given conflict. And so that, of course, that ideal has not happened.
I do think, if I can add, I think there was a profound contradiction within Gallia on the issue of separatism, because on the one hand, she was very much enamored with the right of self-determination, and on the other hand, I think she clearly understood the possibilities for irresponsible action that would lead to bloodshed. And I don't. This contradiction, I remember it being on display in particular when she spoke at the Kennan Institute at the end of her time here. I guess this was in late '89. She was here in '89 or '90. And somebody stood up and said, well, what you're saying is every ethnic group in the world should have the right to split up. How do you have a viable, functioning system? And she really didn't have an answer to that. And I think this is, and I think that she's not alone, but I think that this is one of sort of the gaps that she never quite worked through. And,
well, this was why. Oh, excuse me.
No, and that's why I think it's very hard to know what she would think about present situation.
Well, I think this is why she was so struggling with these issues, that she created these 5 criteria. And she knew perfectly well that they were, you know, when you actually look at the details of them, very tricky to enact. And that's why she said they have to be a package. And every detail and caveat that she has in her longer explication of these criteria show that she's thought through an awful lot of these issues. And perhaps Blair is right. They're very hard to resolve. Anyway, I'm sure there are other questions.
Alexandra?
Thanks. I have a question about her domestic political legacy. And I'm thinking about the situation in the 90s when she was working with Yeltsin, but at odds in some ways with a lot of the other liberal reformers that were running the economic policy, because she always seemed kind of more progressive and more liberal than them, and they felt that they made them look less attractive. And yet after she was killed, they kind of adopted her cause as a way to give them cover so that they were also part of this beautiful liberal legacy of true Democrats. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit how you see her impact on the domestic scene and how, if at all, it reverberates today, if she's still used to kind of cloak the liberals in a way that's to some extent insincere.
I was sort of grappling with what is the legacy today. I think you're right about the 90s. Remember, she was pushed out of Yeltsin's government fairly quickly. She was his not minister but advisor for nationality affairs for about a year and a half, which was sort of cabinet rank. Learned about her dismissal over the radio, which was the way Yeltsin did stuff like that. And really reinvented her political career by getting elected to the Duma from St. Petersburg in '95. And at that point began to have a serious impact in the legislature, which is, I think, where the period you're talking about, which included the economic policy. I wish I could see evidence of that today. It may well be that the crisis currently is going to force people to once again begin to talk seriously about economic policy. I think there's been a real dearth of that, certainly in the Duma. They pass the budgets. They don't debate the policy in any meaningful way. And I would imagine that going back to some of her speeches might be a good way to remind them of what the legislative oversight role is supposed to be.
David?
Marjorie, you mentioned that Galina Starovoitova mentioned President Putin from knowing him earlier on. Did she ever mention Medvedev, or was he of a sufficiently younger generation to not be in the picture?
No, it's an awfully specific question. Of course, I don't know the universe of things that she talked about or people she knew, but the Putin comment was specific because she had known him when he was a first deputy to Mayor Sobchak in Petersburg, but the issues surrounding what we're doing now in terms of imagining what President Putin's legacy is and what Medvedev's continuing policies are, is something that we have to watch play out. They had clearly been close, and I think maybe Harley might have something to add in terms of his knowledge of the circles of power, because there is a kind of cohort from Petersburg that hung around in dachas together, owned dachas in the same area outside of Petersburg, and they did know each other.
She knew him. I never heard her mention him in those days, but that's that's something because we talked about other things. It's an interesting question, and some of the people who knew her might have some memories of it.
Okay. Well,
we've talked a little bit about how she's remembered in Russia, but I was curious how she's remembered in Armenia. Has there been any sort of attempts to create a memory of Galina Starovoitova and her role there?
She's hugely popular in Armenia. She is still very, very well remembered. I haven't been there. I'm not the person to speak about Armenian society and politics that much, but anytime I've ever run across Armenian colleagues, I'm enormously grateful to her. Both the research she did and the activism, clearly. The legacy is there.
There is a school named for her in Yerevan, and I did have an experience a few years ago. I have to go back and look at my trip notes to remind myself exactly which year. I got to Sheremetyevo for a flight home, and something like 50 people carrying packets with their documents all filed into the boarding area. And they were Sumgait Armenians who had been living statusless in Moscow for years and were moving to America. And I started talking to them, and the minute they heard that I knew Galina, they were all over me. The resonance of her name, especially in that community, but I think for Armenians in general, is still fairly strong.
Pavel Polon. Everyone on this side is being quiet, so maybe we'll...
Is it known what has happened with Galina Starovoitova's archive? What's the fate of archive? Was something published after her death? And so I'm interested in it. Thanks.
I think maybe we both answer this. There's one part of this question that allows me to tell a story that I had considered telling. So let me say that the archive she shared with Andrei Sakharov had a very sad demise. I remember being here with her in '93 as we watched the White House being shelled, and she counted the floors and realized on the 18th floor that her own office was being burned, and she said, "My God, the Andrei Sakharov Human Rights Archive is in there." And indeed, we lost, humankind lost a lot from the loss of that particular archive. Her own research and archive material and political legacy material is very well handled by her two incredibly important and loyal assistants, Ruslan Linkov and Luda Yutkovskaya. And those papers and all of the photo archives have been in part put together and published. We have several photograph books and memorial books, including of her writings, with us today if you'd like to see some of it. But apart from what has been published, there's an enormous amount, and I'm sure people will be able to have access to it through the two people I just named.
And also through the Starovoitova Museum in St. Petersburg, which was in serious danger for several years because it occupies prime real estate, and we all know what real estate has been like. Maybe another positive effect of the crisis is some of that will stop for a while, but the authorities appear to have agreed that this is something important that ought to be preserved, and a lot of material is there.
Let's see if this side of the room has any. Okay. I'm going to begin to wrap up, and maybe the place. I have a very strange feeling about this because I don't feel as if the Gallia I knew was in this room. And the reason for that is I think this is what always happens. She was a difficult person. I remember when we established the Galina Starovoitova Fellowship in Human Rights and Conflict Resolution, one very well-placed person came to me and said, ha, 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 ha. If you had conflict, just bring Gallia in, and it escalated. Part of the legacy for me that's missing is the fact that she was full of energy. She was direct. She wasn't afraid of asking tough questions. She wasn't always polite. And I think this gets back to part of Alexandra's question. She's being sanitized. There's that nice park in St. Petersburg. The museum's going to be preserved. There's the plaque where she was assassinated. She is being written into a kind of glossing over of a period of history in which there will be martyrs to a cause, but why they're martyrs for that cause is going to be unknown. They're just going to be that bust in the park. And I think, she could be really, really tough. We all know that. We've all been on the receiving end of it. And she was capable of walking into Yeltsin's office and yelling at him. And one of the problems I think I see in Russia now is leaving aside all of her beliefs and everything else. There's no one who's going to walk into Putin or Medvedev's office and yell at them.
That's perhaps true, but let me tell a counter story. She was that way with Gorbachev. She was very critical during the time that he was president, but she was one of the only people who actually walked up to him as he was packing up to leave, literally, and said, please let's stay in touch. I do admire enormous amounts of what you did do, despite all of the conflict that we've had between us. And they ended up doing joint projects on human rights after he created the Gorbachev Fund. And so she could turn those kinds of things into something productive. And you're right that it's important to be able to talk back to power. Talk truth to power is something Galina knew how to do. But she also knew how to empathize with people, and I think that's what created the populism. So I'm not trying to whitewash, but I am, and I take your point that everyone who is assassinated, who'd already had this kind of profile, is going to end up being sanitized to some degree. You've said something deep in terms of the process of how we memorialize people. But I also think in terms of her, that she was able to have an empathy for people when they were in rotten situations. Gorbachev on the day that he's leaving. That really gets to them as well.
Well, I think, many of you in this room knew her, and I think if you ever had the privilege of being in a room with her, you know, Gali was a force of nature, and Russia's has benefited from the fact that she was there, and I think all of us have benefited from having had the opportunity to know her. So it's with sadness, but with a certain amount of joy that we had a chance to know this remarkable person. And I could tell Galina Starovoitova stories for a long time, but in a certain sense, one of my favorite was at a Kent Institute alumni event where she was seated next to, I'll say who it was, somebody you would think had nothing in common with her, Sasha Tsipko. And they had a ball, and I think that really says a lot about who Galia was, that that empathy was always there, together with a little bit of that fire, and we miss it. Thank you.
Thank you.